Morning from WKYT News, I'm Bill Bryant. We welcome you to Kentucky Newsmakers. Kentucky Senator Rand Paul is often outspoken and doesn't always toe his Republican Party's line. He's also been elected statewide 3 times. Despite strong critics, polling shows that Paul enjoys a high approval rating. Paul also now has years of seniority and serves as chairman of the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee. And in that capacity, he has doubled down his quest to find the origins of COVID-19. Senator Paul has supported most of President Trump's cabinet and high-level nominees. He has expressed opposition to Congresswoman Lori Chavez DeRaymer becoming Labor Secretary. Senator Paul is joining us now from Washington. Senator, thank you very much. We appreciate you being with us.
Thanks for having me, Bill.
You've expressed a lot of support and some concerns about President Trump's early moves. Let's talk about this tariff situation right now. Are you relieved some of those proposed tariffs are on hold? Do you think he got important concessions by threatening them on Mexico and Canada?
You know, I think tariffs have value as a negotiating tool as long as they're not enacted. I think once enacted, they have nothing but economic harm. They're a tax on trade and a tax that ultimately shows up in the price of goods. In Kentucky, we have several industries, and they all tell me they're not interested in tariffs. The bourbon industry is a big part of Kentucky, employ thousands of individuals, and other countries put retaliatory tariffs on us back in 2018, and we still are hurting from those in Europe and other places. So bourbon industry is not interested in this. Automobile industry, they use a lot of steel in the automobile industry. If you put tariffs on steel, the price of steel goes up. And so the automobile industry is not interested in this. We have shippers, both domestic and foreign shipping that comes out of Kentucky. We have Amazon that has a big practice in Kentucky. Really none of these companies come to me and say, oh, we'd love to have tariffs. They all say that they're worried that tariffs will cost jobs and also increase prices. So yeah, I don't think tariffs are a good idea. In the most recent episode, though, was President Trump successful? He was. He was successful in getting Mexico to send troops to the border because it's a lawless border, getting Canada to spend more time with interdiction, drug interdiction, and then he also was able to get Colombia to accept back criminal migrants that had come into our country. So I think, yes, there have been some successes in diplomacy and President Trump getting people to do what they want to do. But as far as an economic thing, I still think tariffs are a bad thing should we enact them.
So you would say it is okay to use them as a big stick to try to bend policy, but don't go so far as to put them in effect.
Yeah, I mean, even our farmers are still asking for money for the punishment they got from the tariffs that went on in 2018 and 2019. China quit buying a lot of our agricultural goods, and so President Trump offered them more subsidies. There's still people saying that the farmers need more subsidies based on the tariffs of 2018 and 2019, many of which are still in place. So it's an acknowledgement that tariffs actually hurt a lot of our people directly and indirectly. So our farmers have not been too happy with the tariffs.
Do you feel Kentucky is particularly vulnerable to tariffs? You know, China has also indicated it would tariff coal at a high rate.
Yeah, I think that, like I say, I don't travel around Kentucky and find almost anybody coming up to me and saying, please put tariffs on. I think most people, you know, just last weekend in Bowling Green, somebody came up to me and said, I'm in the lumber business, you know. We're going to have huge increases in our lumber if you put tariffs on Canadian lumber. Calls, you know, young people trying to buy houses. The interest rates are high, but so are the prices of houses. And if you put a tariff on lumber coming out of Canada, the price of houses will go up even higher.
As chairman of the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, Senator, you have said that you want to get to the bottom of the origins of COVID-19. You have pursued that aggressively in recent years, but now in this position you're able to issue subpoenas and gather facts. Do you feel your committee will arrive at some definitive conclusion?
You know, I can't help but think we're going to discover something more. The reason I believe that is for 3.5–4 years, HHS and particularly NIH has been hiding documents. I get 200-300-page documents completely redacted still after 3 and 4 years. These aren't secret documents. These are just things the NIH wants to keep secret because I think it may show that they made some mistakes. The mistakes were made in not sending this kind of research for scrutiny to the safety committee. What happened is the people who looked at the research in Wuhan skipped the safety committee and just sent it on to Wuhan without having the safety committee analyze this to see if it should be done. Somebody ultimately is going to be responsible for that, but even more importantly, we need to know what the process is so we don't have someone, we don't want this to happen again. We don't want more funds to go funding risky research that could cause a pandemic again.
Is that what primarily motivates you, is preventing a repeat?
Yeah, and also the transparency of it. I think it needs to be in the public. The thing is the more scientists look at this, the better. So instead of having been done in secret, and we don't even know the names of the scientists, why don't we release the minutes of the discussion? Which scientists argued this, which scientists argued that? Because the beauty of having things public is you'll get hundreds of more scientists that will comment on these things, and I think the more the better, particularly for things that are dangerous. There's some things that are so dangerous we probably shouldn't do them. So for example, Ebola. Ebola is transmitted by blood, the same way AIDS is transmitted. And so would you want Ebola to be mutated in the lab so it could be transmitted through the air like the flu? Well, I would think that would be a death wish, since 50% of the people who get Ebola die from the disease. It would be terrible to make Ebola more infectious or easier transmitted through the air. So I think those kind of experiments shouldn't be paid for, shouldn't be funded, and we need to know about it, whether it's classified, whether it's bioweapons, or whether it's somebody trying to develop a vaccine. Making really dangerous viruses more transmissible is something that could kill off a large portion of the planet. We could have a sort of a civilization-ending event from a virus if we're not careful.
Will your ultimate goal of your committee be to present a report that draws some conclusions?
Yeah, there'll be a report and conclusions. We still don't have the information after 4 years, but there's also going to be a bill, and we've written the bill in consultation with scientists across the United States from some of our leading universities. And what we've asked is, how should we police this moving forward? How should we have a thorough discussion of scientists before dangerous research is funded? So this bill is called the Risky Research Reform Act. We passed it in a bipartisan way. We passed it 13-1 out of committee last fall. Because we're in a new Congress, we're going to have to pass it again. It goes before the committee that I'm chairman of. I think we can get a bipartisan vote again. If we do, then my goal is to try to get it into legislation before the whole Senate and the whole House and see if we can get it into law.
Senator President Trump has indicated he favors eliminating the U.S. Department of Education. Congressman Thomas Massey of Kentucky has filed a bill in the House that would do that. Kentucky's Education Commissioner has told us that Kentucky gets about 28% of its funding for schools from the federal government. What are your thoughts on moving ahead with that?
It's been the position of the Republican Party for a long time to believe in local funding and local control of schools. It was part of the national platform from Ronald Reagan on to think and believe that the Department of Education really wasn't adding to our education. When they say they get 28% of funding, I don't believe that is 28% of the funding for actually teaching children. A lot of it goes into DEI propaganda. A lot of it goes into federal testing. And very little of it, I think, goes to pay the salaries of our teachers. Even if some of it were going to the salary of our teachers, I'd rather give it directly to our teachers and not go through the middleman in Washington. You have people in the Department of Education making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, bureaucrats in Washington that teach no one. There's also no objective evidence that since the Department of Education came about in 1980 that we've improved our standing as far as standardized scores versus other countries. In fact, if anything, we've slipped in our education over time. So no, I think local control of schools is better. In Kentucky, our budget, a large portion of it, probably over half, goes to education, and that's a state and local issue, and that's where it ought to be.
So if there is a vote to eliminate the U.S. Department of Education, you will vote for that?
Yep, and I'd send some of the money we save back as direct bonuses to teachers. I'd like to pay the teachers better, I'd also like to set up, and this is more of a state issue, but I'd love to see sort of like the NFL of teachers, extraordinary teachers making a lot more money, but then also having them teach across the United States. So let's say whoever the best explainer of calculus is. There's not a lot of people who can teach calculus, much less explain it. But let's say someone's the best in the country. Really, everybody in the country should take from that person. So instead of having a classroom of 10, maybe you have a classroom of 1 million. All of them taking calculus from one person. You'd still have a local teacher, but maybe the one person who's so good at explaining it that we feed him in via Zoom to the whole country, maybe that person makes several $100,000 a year instead of 70 or 80,000.
Senator Paul, you and Senator Tommy Tuberville have introduced a bill to repeal the Corporate Transparency Act, and you've described it as government overreach. You say it targets small businesses. Supporters said that it was there to be sure government got what it is owed. Do you believe your bill will pass?
We're going to see. I think that the administration is very friendly towards repealing a lot of these regulations now. And the regulations may be well intended, but what they end up doing is just add costs to business. They assume that most people are cheating on their taxes, when in reality, I think the vast majority of people are paying their taxes. And if you want even more people to pay their taxes, the best way to do it is simplify it. Don't make taxes more complicated, make them more simple. Make the rate even lower, kind of like we're doing in Kentucky. In Kentucky, the income tax keeps coming down, and we're trying to become more competitive with places like Tennessee on our southern border that have no income tax. So there are ways to get people to pay more without bullying them and harassing them with more IRS agents. So I think lower tax rates, simplify the tax schedule, and then I think really the vast majority of Americans are and do pay their taxes honorably.
Long before there was DOGE or any top to bottom look at federal government expenditures, you have long published your own list of what you highlighted as government waste, the famous Festivus report. You said that millions was spent in COVID relief money to buy an island. You said the government spent money to censor media outlets, circuses and city parks and so on. Do you think that government waste is in the spotlight now, and are you pleased with that emphasis?
Yeah, I think Elon Musk is drawing attention to a lot of the waste. I mean, some of the stuff is just outrageous. There was an NIH project to spend $600,000 studying the microaggressions against obese Latinx. It's hard to even unpack what the heck that means, but that's the kind of craziness. That's not science. That's just sort of somebody's idea of left-wing propaganda, but that's not science. There was $3 million spent studying girl-centric climate change. Well, when did girls become different than boys in education, that we had to dumb things down and say, oh, well, this is for girls only, and it's in Brazil, for goodness sakes. Why are we teaching anything in Brazil when we're struggling to teach our kids in this country? So there's a lot going on in waste. Elon's pointing out a lot of it. I'm still pointing out a lot of this. But ultimately, it's going to take some votes in Washington to cut the spending levels for some of these agencies that continue to waste our money.
For every line in the budget, there are supporters, of course, who got it in there, and they find that out at the state level in Frankfurt a lot. Is it difficult to cut expenditures with a dedicated following who will descend on lawmakers and explain why it's there?
Yeah, it's very difficult. William Proxmire was a conservative Democrat back in the 70s. He did something called the Golden Fleece Award. And one of his first Golden Fleece Awards was $50,000 to study what makes people happy. And he just thought it was the most ludicrous thing he'd ever heard of. And then he found a study even more ludicrous. It was a study to figure out what makes fish more aggressive, tequila or gin. So they got codfish and they fed half of them tequila and half of them gin. And, I could have told you it was probably going to be tequila. Everybody knows that. But, the thing is the group that funds those things last year was doubled in size. Now, I voted against that, but they doubled the size of the National Science Foundation. This is the group that I pointed out, studied about $1 million to study whether or not Japanese quail are more sexually promiscuous on cocaine. This is the same group that studied whether lonely rats use more cocaine than well-socialized rats who have a lot of friends. And so, this kind of stuff goes on and on. But just a year ago, Every Democrat up here, and unfortunately half the Republicans sided with them, voted to double the size of the department called the National Science Foundation. So yeah, it's tough to get the votes, but the more we talk about it, maybe the angrier people will get, and they'll call their representatives and say, enough's enough, quit wasting my money.
President Trump has suggested that FEMA could be eliminated or at least substantially altered. And, we've seen the tornadoes in western Kentucky, in your state, and flooding in eastern Kentucky in recent years. Do we need a different approach, a substantially different approach to disaster and recovery in this country?
I think if we made FEMA closer to home, it would do better. So, for example, many of the big storms now, the federal government pays 75%, the state government 25%. The problem with that is the federal government has a printing press, the Federal Reserve, and they can buy up all this debt. So we have $36 trillion in debt. The state of Kentucky has some debt in its pension system, but for the most part, it balances its annual budget. In fact, they've been saving money in recent years. The reason you want the state to pay for it is not because you wish people harm or you wish them not to get disaster relief, but because the states have to make a more prudent analysis and they have to not waste the money. So there's going to be better oversight, the bigger stake that the state government has, because the state government is somewhat compelled to balance their budget. This would also be true of the fires in California. If instead of the federal government swooping in with $300 billion to help them out, if it were half California, maybe people would ask some tough questions like, maybe we should burn off the underbrush on when there's an non-windy season in really controlled fashions. Maybe we could rake up, bulldoze, and clean up the forest. Maybe we could use the ocean water to fill up cisterns or fill up large reservoirs up in the hills right off the coast of California to have an abundance of water when these fires get going. But those hard decisions aren't ever made because it's going to be somebody else's money. And that's why it gets back to what Milton Friedman said: nobody spends somebody else's money as wisely as their own. So the more local you make the spending, the more local you make the decisions, the better decisions you'll get, because local people will show up at the town hall and tell them, we want it to be spent wisely.
Well, Senator, do you believe the federal government has a role to play in addressing climate change or investigating whatever it is that is creating these increasingly volatile weather patterns that we've been seeing?
Yeah. With regard to pollution and things like that, yeah, there is a common ground where the government can have some role. With regard to fires burning, if you look at the overall area of land where fires are burning over the last couple of decades, there's actually less land being burned, less land in Africa being burned, less land in Europe being burned. In California, there's more. In Texas, there's less. So really, I think it has to do with policies towards fire control and less to do with some overarching theory of global warming. I think it has more to do with fire prevention and with trying to do common sense things to keep these wildfires from getting out of control.
All right, you joined TikTok and you oppose it being banned. Do you think that is where it will end up, that it will continue to exist?
Yeah, I thought maybe I was too old to be on TikTok, but it turns out there are old people like me on TikTok too. So yeah, I joined, and our initial video had over 5 million people view it. Interestingly, the Biden administration and the Trump administration, the last one, wanted to ban TikTok, but then they both went on it for campaign purposes and had billions of views. So it is quite effective at getting your word out, and particularly getting young people to watch, and listen to what you're trying to do. So it is speech, and I just don't see how the courts could have messed this up. But the courts basically said, well, if Congress says it's national security, it's national security, it's not speech. But, to the 170 million primarily young people in America looking at it, I don't think they think it has anything to do with national security. I think they think it has to do with dance videos, dog videos, cat videos, everything under the sun. And so I don't think we should ban speech. I'm a First Amendment sort of advocate, and I don't like to see government limiting people's ability to express themselves. So I have a bill to repeal the ban, and I also think you can't take someone's property without a trial convicting them of something. 60% of the people who own TikTok are actually non-Chinese. They're just international investors. So it's actually a minority of the ownership is Chinese. And so I think we didn't think about this logically because there's a hysteria towards Chinese right now. And the thing is trade with China, I've got a lot of criticisms of their government. I think they accidentally leaked the pandemic and got it started. But at the same time, I don't want to end trade with China because the average Kentuckian saves about $1,000, is about $1,000 richer every year because of trade with China. If you buy stuff at Walmart at a reasonable price, a lot of it's because it comes from China. So I think it would just make us poorer if we quit trading with them. We can still complain, we can cajole, we can try to get them to behave better, but I'm not for ending trade with China.
Senator, just a few seconds left. Do you have any insights on whether your Kentucky Senate colleague Mitch McConnell will retire or run for another term?
I don't know, and that's ultimately going to be his decision. He stepped down in leadership this year, and a lot of people think that may be a prelude to not running again. But he's got to make that decision himself, and I think he'll probably let people know fairly soon, but I don't have any inside information on it.
Senator Rand Paul, we thank you very much for joining us on Kentucky Newsmakers. Appreciate it. Stay with us. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to Kentucky Newsmakers. So it's busy both in Washington and in Frankfort. And this last week, we learned more about what Kentucky lawmakers may focus on in the coming weeks of the legislative session. Republican Senate President Robert Stivers answered questions about several issues during a meeting, and Senate Democrats announced their priorities. WKYT's Phil Pendleton is breaking down some of the issues that may be discussed at the state capitol.
So we're very leery of touching anything right now.
Senate President Robert Stivers says it's kind of a wait-and-see approach to what's happening in Washington, but he did say executive orders, tariffs, and other items could have state lawmakers acting.
We're in a position now that I think this session is going to be one that we may be more reactive than proactive.
Changes in Medicaid will impact Kentucky. States could be asked to take on more responsibilities if the Department of Education is dissolved.
More of a coordinator than an entity that would mandate or dictate policy.
Senate Democrats announced their priorities Wednesday as well. They include fully funding public education and helping people with housing.
Creating more affordable housing opportunities through tax credits and first-time homebuyer support.
Senator Reggie Thomas has pushed for a hike in the minimum wage the past several sessions, but the Republican majority feels much different about that.
Thomas wants the wage eventually raised to $15 an hour. Stivers says many places already pay good wages.
So I don't think there is much of an appetite to change it because the natural course of our society has done it.
So I just don't understand when I hear someone say that there's no appetite for it because people are making more wages, because that's not true.
Thomas says raising the wage does not cost the state anything and will lead to more tax revenue. In Frankfort, Phil Pendleton, WKYT.
Senate Democrats say they also look to widen the availability of medical marijuana and to make exceptions to Kentucky's abortion ban. And a high priority for Republicans during this legislative session already made it to the governor's desk. The Democratic governor, Beshear, signed a bill this week cutting the state income tax. That bill brings the rate down from 4% to 3.5%. The lowered income tax will go into effect next January, and in signing the cut, the governor highlighted bipartisan support to help ease high costs for Kentuckians. Kentucky lawmakers are also considering a bill that would limit the governor's pardoning power.
What this measure does is a very common sense measure. It forces the executive or the party of the executive to stand in front of the voters and account for the actions that they take.
Senate Bill 126 would prevent a governor from granting pardons 30 days before an election until the next inauguration. It's proposed as a constitutional amendment, meaning Kentuckians will be voting on it if it gets through. WKYT's Kristen Kennedy breaks down the bill and the previous governor's pardons.
Legislators drafted Senate Bill 126 in reaction to former Governor Matt Bevin's last-minute pardons. Bevin lost his re-election campaign in 2019 And in the weeks before he left office, he pardoned and commuted the sentences of close to 600 people. The Secretary of State's office says that Governor Bevin pardoned the most of any governor, 285 people. Of those Bevin pardons, we know 5 of those individuals were convicted of killing people. One was Patrick Bryant Baker. He was one of 5 charged in 2017 in a deadly home invasion. He was pardoned in 2019. A few years later, he was sent back to prison, this time on a federal conviction of murder for the same home invasion. Kurt Smith was convicted of murder in 2002. His sentence was life in prison with a possibility of parole in 20 years. He was pardoned by Bevin in 2019, and then in 2024, he was back in jail, this time for a new case. Lexington police say Smith assaulted a woman so badly that he left her with a traumatic brain injury. We don't know if Smith would still be in jail if not for his pardon, but we do know that the new bill would prevent governors from granting pardons in their final days in office. For WKYT Investigates, I'm Kristen Kennedy.
And stay with us now. We'll be back. We'll wrap up Kentucky Newsmakers from WKYT in just a moment. Welcome back, and as we get ready for next week's Kentucky Newsmakers, the Kentucky Legislature will continue its session in Frankfort. The 2025 session has been a busy one so far. We expect that to continue, and we'll have coverage, of course, on air and online at WKYT.com and on WKYT News. That's Kentucky Newsmakers for this week. We do thank you so much for joining us, and we hope you make it a good week ahead.